Thanks for tuning in, everyone, to another episode of Let's Talk, where we meet with interesting people from different walks of life, talk about their journey to success and how they got to where they are today. Before we get started, hit that subscribe button, click that bell so you see when another video goes live. And today I have with me Jeff Genge. How you doing today, Jeff?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great, Eric. It's really a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah. I'm happy you could do this. And I know, especially in the times right now, everyone's doing stuff on Zoom. So I'm happy that you could just be comfortable in your own house and meet and talk about your work.
Hey, no problem. And it's actually really nice to have a real conversation with people that you sort of only know online.
Yeah.
Hear a voice, get to know somebody. It's nice. I like to do these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad. Thanks for being here. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? Kind of tell everyone what it is you do, where you're from, all that good stuff.
Well, my name is Jeff Genge, and I live on Prince Edward Island, Canada, a little island in the Maritimes off the east coast of Canada near Nova Scotia, Newfoundland. Those are places people may have heard of. Most people haven't heard of Prince Edward Island unless they're big fans of Anne of Green Gables. That's our big claim to fame out here. I co-write a paranormal adventure series with my wife Michelle. We have two books. First one is Terra Obscura, A Knock in the Dark, which we released early in 2019, and then we followed it up with book two, Terra Obscura, Falling Against Gravity, which came out late in 2019, and we're working on book three now during these COVID times. So that's
Yeah.
the creative side of my life.
What obviously we're going to dive into your books and I do want to talk about that. But what so you co-write with your wife.
Yes.
Is there any friction there when you guys are working on something?
Well, there was a worry of friction for sure.
Yeah, that's why I ask.
Yeah, no, and it's valid. In fact, that's a common question that we get, and it's I wouldn't want to call it friction. When we started the process, my wife, who is a novelist as well, on her own merit, she and I decided to take some screenplays that I had written and novelize them, and so that was the impetus behind the Terra Obscura in the beginning. But there was a certain amount of nervousness about two people working on the same writing project, especially someone that you live with.
Yeah.
But we managed to find a process that works actually surprisingly well and sort of complements our strengths. Not to say we don't have some heated conversations, some evenings about some aspects of editing and writing, but for the most part, it's bared pretty good fruit, I think.
When you have a disagreement, do you always go with her idea?
She would. No, and she. The big thing with my wife and I is we're both Aries. We're both pretty strong personalities, and we both need to have a case made for something to be accepted. So we have to really not argue in the fighting sense, but argue in the logic sense of why we feel something needs to be the way it is. So if we don't like the direction something's going in, or if we don't like a descriptor or something, it's a pretty thorough discussion. And I think writing with that sort of scrutiny has actually produced some very strong work.
Yeah, it has to. I
think it does. I realized, as much as it can be a little painful sometimes, it's worth it, because I feel like for my ideas to get past her scrutiny, that they'll pass most people's scrutiny.
Yeah, and it's got to help even just like overall story. It's like you're trying to do something that's like why, and then you immediately have to explain everything. That's so beneficial.
Exactly. It is, and I don't necessarily recommend it to everybody, but we have definitely we found our way, and so we also kind of like I said, we've established a sort of pattern or system that we use where generally I write first draft. The first books were based on my scripts that I had written. And so what Michelle does then is she takes those scripts and she sort of stretches them back out again, you know, in a sort of basic way, like just expanding the ideas that are inherently there in the script, and and add things that she feels may be missing from a very stripped down story, which is a script. And so once she goes through the whole thing once, then I take it back and I go through the whole thing from beginning to end, making notes and additions and edits to all of her work. And so then she takes it back, and we don't give it back to one another until we're completely through of the whole project, and then it goes back to the other one, and they do their layer then on top of it, and that raises all sorts of questions throughout the process, that we then have to address as we work through the various edits. And my approach has been, when I know there's a thing that we're going to have to really hammer out, I try to leave those all to sort of like the last, you know, work on the easy stuff. The things that I feel like we can agree on eventually, the fewer, say less than a half a dozen things that may be real roadblocks for us, I usually save those for like just the perfect evening. You know, we'll get a bottle of wine and then we'll sit down and we'll work through those potentially more contentious debates. And like I said, you know, if I can't make my case to her or she can't make her case to me, then it brings into question whether or not it's a good idea.
Yeah. That has to have been not just the book, but like so beneficial for the marriage, because you're sitting down and you're not just like, hey, the flowers are looking good today, which there's nothing wrong with that, but you're like you're having serious conversations.
It is. It was like I said, it was a little intimidating at first conceptually, I have to admit. But in hindsight, I think it's really been great, especially at this stage and this age. We've been married now, coming up on 25 years.
Cool. Congratulations.
Yeah, so a long time.
Yeah.
And it's nice to have some truly new thing going on that is exciting to both of us. And we're both quite invested in. So that's been a really nice addition to our lives, marriage, you know.
Was it, so you said she was a novelist before, a writer before, right?
Yeah. So it's funny because I'm not one of these people who has always dreamed of being a writer. I kind of came to it very late in life. I'm an avid reader, and I'm a lifelong fan of science fiction, adventure, novels, and comics, and film, and all those things. And I'm a bit of a critic against bad writing, for sure. Like that's you know, my main beef with things, you know, bad writing. And so kind of stumbled into this idea. That's another interesting story later on. But this idea of terra obscura, and it just kind of rattled around for a while, and I realized what potential it had. And so I just started making notes and started collecting everything in this notebook, because I just felt like these were great ideas. And then one day I was kind of left with, like, what are you doing with this notebook full of these ideas? Like, are you going to actually do something with this? And so I started, you know, writing a script for a television pilot, because ultimately that was where I had seen it. I'd seen it as being something that I want to see on film. Michelle, on the other hand, she went to university and has a master's in business, but also a degree in writing and literature, and has always wanted to be a writer. And she had worked on several novels throughout the years, and she was a big supporter of these ideas and this project that I was working on. And that meant a lot, you know, having that sort of support from somebody who, again, is, you know, critical of your work, for them to be on board and think that, you know, this really has merit, and there's something really good here. Her desire to be involved with it was good fuel to keep me motivated. So after I wrote the first couple of screenplays, it was and I had submitted them to a few competitions and to a few professional editors, and got some really good feedback, which made me realize, yeah, it's not just me, like somebody else
Hmm.
sees the merit in these ideas. But I just felt like I really wanted to tell the long story. There was a long
Hmm.
story here that I really wanted to tell. And I started feeling like, if someone was interested in a pilot script and offered you some, relatively small amount of money for it, you'd kind of feel compelled to almost sell it. And you might never get to tell that long story.
Yeah.
So we decided that it would be more advantageous for us and more enjoyable for us to actually have the opportunity to tell that longer story. So we realized that by turning these scripts into novels, we would have, we maintain some control over what it was that where the story was going to head.
Hmm.
And so, not to say that I wouldn't love for somebody to come and ask me if they could make it
Sure.
into a television show
Yeah,
someday.
sure. Yeah.
But
Every
but
author's
I
like,
wanted
no, please don't.
I
Please
wanted to
don't.
create the universe first.
Yeah. I'm sure every author's dream is like, no, please don't come and offer me a whole bunch of money and take money. Yeah. So, but
Well,
you.
truthfully, my concern was more that as an independent writer with no portfolio and no background, that you could probably be very easily swayed and have no bargaining room and end up selling a great idea for something very
Yeah,
low.
very low.
And so, really believing in this, we wanted to play the long game.
I think you hit on something that I be- believe. I'm trying to figure out how to formulate this. I don't find anything wrong with TV shows or movies, but the long game of books is something I enjoy more. I feel like
Yeah.
there's more character development. The story can unravel at a slower pace. Doesn't mean the book's slow and dragging, but the story can take longer.
Well, and as having written the scripts, like a script is so much about parsing out any extra and
Hmm.
getting it down, distilling it down to its very core ideas and the simplest forms and the most expressive simplest forms. And so it's an interesting process to go through that and cut away all the things that are extraneous. But going back from a script to a novel is a very rewarding experience because you get to go back into that story
Mm.
and put back all the things that you took out, but put them back in a much richer and more thorough and more thought out fashion.
That's so interesting.
So that I've actually really enjoyed that process.
That's so interesting. Let's go ahead
Because
and
you,
dive in. What's what's the story about? I've got a picture up of your first book, A Knock in the Dark. It's cool name. I like the name. What
thank
can you
you.
tell us without giving too many spoilers?
Well, so the story is set in 1906. And it follows the adventures of Charles Fort. Now, some of your viewers may be aware of Charles Fort. A lot of people aren't because he was a pretty obscure character, but he's an American researcher and, in some ways, the first paranormal investigator.
And this is true.
And
This part's true.
this is a real character, yeah, Charles Fort. And so I've always been fascinated with him. He was a very strange little man who spent his life between the big libraries in New York and London and a few places around the world, basically going through journals and magazines and periodicals and isolating all the little tidbits in that era that science failed to explain. So, like a rain of fish in India, or sightings of giant hairy men in the woods, and lights in the sky, and all these sorts of things. He was collecting all of these little tidbits,
Interesting.
and he what he would do is he would obsessively write them out on little tiny scraps of paper, and then roll them up and organize them almost in a database of giant little scraps of paper.
Oh my
It was like
god.
he had his own little system,
Oh my
and he
god.
had tens of thousands of these. And he lived a very quiet life, a very mundane life in a lot of ways. And I always thought it was so. He wrote a few books, and eventually had a society named after him, the Fortean Society. And his name Fort eventually became synonymous with paranormal. Like it's more of a thing in the UK, but there's a magazine there called the Fortean Times, and it harkens back to this society that was created by some of his patrons, at the end of his life, other people who were interested in the strange and the bizarre and the supernatural. And so I like I said, I always found this character fascinating, and I thought, wouldn't it be really cool to say that to examine a version of this character where he actually had this richer secret life that we never knew about, that history has forgotten, and we're left with this story that he was a boring little man who spent his life in the back corners of dark libraries, but really the truth of the matter is he was out in the world actually investigating paranormal phenomena at the dawn of the 20th century. And I also really like that era, because that era before World War One, before the sinking of the Titanic, that's a really great era full of really rich characters that are a little underexamined in today's culture. Like, and it was a time when the world was really brimming with an optimism, because there hadn't been any large wars for about 40 or 50 years, and technology was ramping up, and inventors were king at that time. You know, at that time there was, I think, 700 different patents for a light bulb. You know, like everybody was competing for what was going to be the next great thing. And so there was all this optimism in especially America at that time, I think, where people actually believed the world was just going to keep getting better and better and better. And then, you know, along comes the Titanic, World War One, and suddenly, you know, everybody's kind of knocked back a few steps, where they realize, wait a second, this curve we've been going on is going to be seriously disrupted. And so I'm really trying to tell a bunch of stories back in that gilded age of optimism that existed before everything took a turn.
That's so interesting. And so you're
Thanks.
you're following Fort around as he investigates things?
Yeah, and so Fort, we've taken Fort at a young point in his life, and we try to really use a lot of facts from his life in this fictional story that we're telling. And we've also built this sort of group around him, where his best friend, who some of your viewers may know, Robert Ripley from Ripley's Believe It or Not. So, you know, his best friend is Ripley, and they're
actually his best friend.
No, but they were, but they did exist in the same era at the same time in the same cities. You know.
Okay, yeah.
So we've made them good friends, and also use that as a vehicle for exploring, you know, complicated male relationships. Like, I feel like that's another thing that's underexplored in this era of, you know, examining all sorts of different lifestyles and relationships and personality types, that, you know, the complicated nuances of brotherly love, you know, friends who are best of friends, but maybe at the core not the best for each other. You know, so I've always been a big fan of things like, you know, the X-Files, you know, Indiana Jones, a lot of these sorts of things, you know, this sort of adventure and mystery. And I thought it would be really great to tell a type of X-Files-esque story, but set in an era where science was just starting to catch up with what people wanted to be able to do. And so you have this sort of buddy story, but it's about two extreme personalities who kind of goad each other on, but not always. They really love one another, and they're really trying to do what's best for each other, but without really taking in consideration how the other one feels often. And just those nuanced complexities of complicated male relationships. You know, I thought that would be an interesting thing to explore.
It sounds interesting.
Honestly, it's great, and you'll see I feel like a lot of men will see, you know, remnants of their own relationships. You know, complicated male relationships.
Yeah, male friendships are very complicated.
Well, issues of jealousy and confidence, and all these sorts of like little subtle things that kind of permeate into relationships that we kind of try to dismiss, but inevitably influence us.
Yeah. All right. So, is this book them investigating one specific event?
Yeah. So the way that we've sort of framed the series is, I like to call them case books. So, for
Hmm.
example, book one is a case book of a certain investigation. And the nice thing about that is we try to structure it where there's like a main story that's being a main investigation. But in the periphery, there's
Hmm.
these other smaller stories and investigations also being worked
Okay.
out. The impetus behind the original idea for this came from a conversation with my daughter years ago now, when I was picking her up from school one day and we were driving home in the truck, and she was a big fan of the X-Files at that time. She was just discovering, she was like a 15-year-old discovering the X-Files. And she was also a big fan of a show that's popular on the BBC called Murdoch Mysteries. I don't know if you'd be
I've
familiar
heard
with
of it. I
that.
haven't seen it. I've heard of it though.
So it's a pretty nice show. It's a excuse me, it's set in the around the same era, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, but it follows a forensic investigator at the dawn of forensic investigation.
Mm.
And so
Okay.
he is often discovering things that we now hold as commonplace, almost tropes. Like he's pioneering fingerprinting technology and all these sorts of things.
So cool.
And everybody looks at him like he's kind of a quack for,
Yeah.
exploring this. And so we got to discussing how neat it would be to tell like an X-Files story in the same sort of vein where people are exploring things that are now common day tropes, but before they had that sort of lens. Like if I was to say aliens to you, you might have an image pop into your head of little men with almond shaped eyes, pale,
The
and
skinwalkers,
whatever.
right?
Yeah, but if you go back 100 years, those tropes didn't exist. If you said people from another world, people would just think of maybe humans or whatever. So I wanted to really explore that idea of paranormal events before this modern era where these things are all tropes.
Yeah.
And so in the Knock in the Dark, it's the coming together of Fort and Ripley for the first time after a long time. They'd been separated for years, and they've come back to the city. And Fort has inherited his family's wealth, which is something that actually did happen to Charles Fort.
Okay.
And with that wealth, he's decided to really dive into his true dream of investigating the world's mysteries, and is dragging his reluctant friend with him on these adventures. And some of that is about, like, for Fort, he needs an audience. Like, there's a certain aspect of his character that needs somebody to kind of be there to sort of cheer him on. It's not enough for him to just pursue these things alone. He wants his best friend with him when he's going on these adventures. But, his best friend is, somebody who has a certain amount of, like, built up jealousy about, Fort's successes already at this point. And so it creates some of these tensions, and Fort's a very domineering personality. And he is, and also our version of Fort, he's quite fascinated with radical new technologies at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So he's really embracing all these new technologies that are coming on. Excuse me. And so we created a story. Sort of, the first book is really like an intro to all the characters and this world, and it follows a series of murders that take place during the construction of the New York subway system,
Okay.
which was happening at that time.
Which, like, today is like, that's just how New York is a subway system, right?
Yeah. And so it's really cool to go back to New York in 1906, and it's still, one of the biggest cities in the world, but very, very different. And
awesome.
There's a lot of political power being displayed, and this drive to bring the city together with the subway system, and concerns that the appearance of some sort of paranormal situation may disrupt all these vested interests to create this what will eventually become the New York City subway system.
What a great idea. I think that's a great idea. Because, like, obviously, building a subway system is not easy to begin with. Then what happens if something paranormal happens at the same time? That's a good question.
Well, it raises this sort of idea, like, I don't want to give too much away, but there's something down there. And the powers that be are concerned that the naturalists of the time are going to come along and want to preserve it, or
Mm,
you know, interfere with
yeah.
the construction because maybe there's some habitat here or something.
Yeah. Where can people find your book? Amazon?
Yeah, the books are available on Amazon. They're also available at some of the bigger retailers. We can't guarantee that they're in every town, but
Sure.
they're available to like the Indigos. We have it published on Ingram Spark, which allows it to be in Chapters, Barnes and Noble, all those sorts of
Okay.
places. We also sell them we sell them locally everywhere here, and they do pretty well. It's people seem to be responding very well to it.
Okay.
But for the easiest way for most people is the easiest way it is for most things. It's Amazon.
Amazon. Yeah.
Yeah.
Terra Obscura: A Knock in the Dark is book one. Uh,
Yeah.
we are going to talk about book two.
Sure.
And so if you don't want spoilers, skip ahead because after book two, we're going to talk more about just his life in general, and that'll be a good conversation. But if you don't want spoilers, that may or may not happen. It depends on what he says. Just go by the book series now. That's my warning for you. Now we're going to talk
That's a
about
great plug. Thank you.
now we're going to talk about a book two,
So book two,
Falling Against Gravity.
They're Falling Against Gravity, it picks up right at the end of book one, which is great because book one has a kind of a surprise at the end that really pulls people right into book two.
Okay.
And book two just continues this adventure. And book two is a bridge because the goal has always been to take this international. So the story starts off in New York, and book two is about them becoming international explorers.
Okay.
So in book two, we examine a little bit of Charles Fort's past, where when he felt he was a little bit too young and a little bit too amateur and a little naive in his early attempts to investigate the paranormal, and got himself into a rather serious predicament. But comes out of that early youthful investigation with an artifact, and the artifact is something that he then brings to a rather cynical and jaded and a bit of a broken Nikola Tesla, who he then works with to create ultimately their own flying ship. And so this really brings in the whole sort of steampunk element that is woven throughout the series. I'm a big fan of that whole
What's not to
steampunk
love about
aesthetic.
steampunk? People out there who don't like steampunk, I don't get it. Like, it's fine if you don't read it or write it, but there's just something cool about it.
It's gorgeous, like I'm a big fan of the aesthetic, and again, because I like that era, there's always lots of content there for me, like there's just so many great characters out of that time that we sort of imagine steampunk being set in.
Yeah.
And so the book two is about the test flight of this prototype airship that they've been creating, but in it again another investigation is being pursued, and again it really explores these complicated relationships, people who really do care about one another but maybe don't know how to treat them the best. And we have a few other characters that are surprisingly popular. It's funny, like there are a few characters in the story that I had originally conceived of being more background characters, but the response we get from our fans is really that they want more of those characters. They find them compelling, and so that as a writer is really rewarding, because here are these characters that I hadn't really planned on giving much prominence. Really, those are the ones that people are like, I'm fascinated by, Fort's butler.
Right.
Like, want to know more about Fort's butler.
Yeah, that's the best problem to have, right? Like, we want more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we have a very very strong female character in it, a woman who's an engineer. We try to bring a lot of different perspectives into the book. So we have, because New York at that time was a hotbed of immigration, we try to really bring in a lot of characters who have backgrounds outside the U.S. And they always bring, like every immigrant, they bring their story and their history with them. So our engineer / pilot of this prototype airship is a woman who whose family has a past with Nikolai's, and she's brought into the story just for being an exceptional engineer. But she's a rather unique character because she has a lot of grace and strength and power in a time when women typically don't, and
Mm.
it really the men really don't know how to deal with her.
Yeah.
They just She doesn't fit any of the normative roles that they're used to, and so the fact that she's a beautiful woman and not interested in her beauty or what she can do with it, but is more interested in her mind and her skills, leaves the men around her sometimes a little befuddled as to how to address her and to take her. And that has proven to be quite an interesting relationship as well.
Sure.
This woman who's not interested in people's approval. Um, with this bit mix of characters, we get to tell some great stories, and almost everybody in this book has some sort of problem, and you
Just
get
like
to,
people.
you get to kind of some little psychological problem or habitual
Yeah.
problem or something. Something has broken a part of them in their life, and you get to kind of like play with that, and it's a little bit fun. I have to say, like, I love doing terrible things to my characters, and writing has given me just so many options of doing absolutely horrible things to people,
Yeah.
and having fun doing it.
Yeah. That's a common thread I've learned from writers is they like to do bad things to their characters, but not just because they're like sadists, these weird people, but it's like they want to know how their characters are going to respond.
Yeah.
And what do they do and how do they evolve as people, because like it's the troubling times in life that change, that help develop us, right? When
Yes.
everything's going great, you have no idea that you have to learn something and grow.
Yeah, exactly. And and honestly, I mean, I have my characters that don't survive. There's always those characters because ultimately there's a bit of horror and creepy in these books. It's that's what
Okay.
keeps the tension up, is that they are actually in dangerous situations. But um, I just love I love putting people through a psychological ringer. Like really
Yeah.
seeing how far you could push a character without breaking them. And so in the longer story, th- that is something that we're
Okay.
really trying to explore. Is what is it that makes a hero, and what is it that makes a villain? And
Mm.
just because you're a hero at one time doesn't mean you're the hero of the story, and just because you're the villain at one time doesn't mean you're the villain of the whole story. Like,
Yeah.
there's all these different things that happen to a person that maybe in certain circumstances they would handle it well and behave admirably, but maybe sometimes they succumb to their own weaknesses.
Yeah.
So,
It's just so many good questions that you just raised. Obviously, we don't have to dive into them, but like those
well, no, go
and
ahead
that
if you got one.
well, no, it's that's the point of reading the book is you gotta go along for the
Yeah,
ride and figure it out. So I don't want to dive too deep into them, but that's such a good question. It's like just in even just in life, like just because you did something bad doesn't necessarily mean you're a bad person forever. You can change.
exactly. And ultimately, I also want to test friendships. Like, if you really had a best friend in every sense of the word, what is the breaking point of that relationship?
Mm,
You know,
it's a
and
good
so
question.
Ford and Ripley are constantly testing that aspect. Like, what is just one step over the edge of like really pushing
Mm.
this friendship too far.
Yeah, just looking back, I've got some good friends, um, but if we're in a subway system with some paranormal activity going on, and not like, is it paranormal or is it not, but like I'm sure it's actually paranormal activity, then I don't know how good my friends are going to be.
Yeah, who's really there for you?
Yeah,
And
it's a different testing situation.
well, and there's all that conversation that happens in a person's head. Like, there are some jealousies between these characters, and the other parties are often not privy to the fact that, they may love you, but there are certain aspects of your character that they really don't admire.
Mm, sure. Yeah.
And never knowing, where those boundaries lie.
Yeah. It sounds great. It sounds like the relationships are real. Like this is like how people actually act with each other.
Well, and that's one of the great things we're getting feedback from in our reviews. Like a lot of the reviews on Amazon talk about the relationships, and that is so rewarding because I went into this wanting to like have a high adventure,
Hmm.
paranormal, fest of experiences, and the relationships were almost sort of secondary in the crafting of
Hmm.
of work. But so much work ended up going into those, and now seeing that people really love these complicated, nuanced relationships and want to see more of them.
Now,
That's been a real reward, I have to say.
is that something that you were always good at, or is it kind of like something that your wife points out whenever she reads it? Is it a
I
bounce
don't
back and
know.
forth?
I think it's back and forth. Like, um, I'm a 46-year-old man. I've had lots of long-term, complicated, brotherly
Hmm.
relationships. And they're one thing at one time in your life, and then they're another thing at another time in your life. And as you grow, these relationships, there's the people around you that you thought would always be your best friend. But some life events come, go, things change, and people that you maybe didn't weren't that close with at one time, you realize over the long term that maybe that was where your a really good friend was.
Mm.
And so I'm a bit of an overthinker by nature, and so I've often dwelt on the nature of some of these things. And I think, as I was saying, I'm quite a critic of other people's writing. So
Mm.
we do hold ourselves to a fairly high bar in terms of why is this happening. There you have to be able to answer that all the time. Like, is there a reason for what's happening here? Because if there's not, then perhaps it's not useful.
Yeah, I think that's a tip that all writers need is can you can you justify this being there other than I like it? Like,
Exactly.
yeah, what purpose does it have? Is it pushing the story forward
Well,
in
I think
some way?
that's a bit of a dangerous thing for a writer, and that's where I think we have some success with the having to bat things back and forth. Is that as a solitary writer, you can really pursue the things that you are fascinated by,
Hmm.
but that doesn't mean anybody else is going to be nearly as fascinated by these things as you are. So having to like put every single thing you're doing through the scrutiny of another person's lens,
Yeah,
really I think helps parse out what's the gem in all of this.
yeah, I think that's really good. I'm just thinking like I love blacksmithing. I think it's the coolest thing ever. People making swords is the most fascinating thing to me.
This is pretty interesting.
But I'm not going to write a 300-page book on someone who's a blacksmith.
Right.
That's those
Even though you might be very well tempted
yeah,
to.
yeah, those exist. They're called historical. They're called historical writings. But I can make a character who's a blacksmith, and there's a scene that is interesting, and it develops
Mm.
the character. And so the purpose there would be developing the character, going through this thing. That's my thought.
Well, it's very similar because, like, I've always had a really keen interest in of that sort of pop culture supernatural from a very young age. Those old Reader's Digest
Okay.
encyclopedia sets, mysteries of the unknown, and those sorts of TV shows when I was young, and those sorts of novels and comics, and then into all the movies and X Files, and like I said, Indiana Jones, all these sorts of things that were always like a little bit of paranormal, esoteric, history or whatever, high strangeness. And I had a lifetime of this sort of stuff in my head, which for the most part is essentially useless. You know, having a, having a head full of like UFO history is really not much use to anything. Um, but then all of a sudden, when I started really working on this series, I realized, like, in so many ways, like I'm just the perfect guy to write this
You've been studying
because
for
I
your
have got
whole
such
life.
yeah, I've been practicing for this my whole life. I've got a head full of this crap that is so nice to be able to pull out of obscurity and rework it so that it actually
Yeah.
fits the context. That's something that I really prize in my books is that, and it's great because I have a few teenagers as beta readers, um, friends of my
Sure.
daughters who are very bright, intelligent readers, and it's great. And when they're reading the books, they'll often come across these characters or situations, and then they'll stop reading, they'll go to Wikipedia,
Oh,
they'll
that's
type
so
it in, and
funny.
this was a real thing.
That is
Like,
so
you know,
funny.
it really was a UFO crash in 1897 in
Oh my
Texas.
gosh.
You
That
know,
is so
like,
funny.
and it is, and that to me is a real reward when somebody tells me they can never get through the book because they're too busy going back to the internet to
Yeah.
look up stuff.
Yeah. Uh, you I feel like you described something that was really important. It's the idea, the mantra, whatever you want to call it, of write what you know, and this happens to be what you know. Now the
Yeah.
downside is if someone doesn't know anything, they're going to think they can't write anything. The answer to that is no, just go learn stuff.
Yeah.
Go learn stuff.
And so that's the other thing. Like when I say that I have this head full of stuff, you know, it's usually very the periphery of something.
Right.
You know, I know that thing happened, or I know that person was involved in that thing. I still have to go do a lot of research to find out, you know, how I can use it in a story.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's some things. I mean, I don't know. They're paranormal investigators, so I'm sure there's some things, even just investigations, that you had to learn.
Yeah. Well, and it's
unless
funny.
Unless you were an investigator for 40 years before you wrote the book. I don't know.
No, but I was an investigator for a period of time. I don't know if you can see this.
Oh, were you?
Yeah,
Man.
I was. Yeah, so I do have a bit of that sort of process that I've learned, and I get to use a bit of that, you know. So like I said, you know, I was perfect for writing these books. I've been doing this, you know, my whole life. Just didn't realize it.
That's so interesting. That's so interesting. So you said you're working on book 3.
Working on book 3 right now. Yeah.
Can you give us a teaser?
Give you a teaser. Well, like the structure I like to have is one book flows right into the next. You know, keeps. I like high pacing. I like to keep my foot on the pedal.
Okay.
As soon as you get going, it just keeps building and building and building, and then, you know, there's usually a huge spectacular ending, a little bit of a lull, and it leads right into the next adventure. I want it to feel like these people are caught up in a whirlwind all the time, even though they live in an era of slow travel. You know, we sometimes cut that sort of stuff out of the story. Yeah. It's like 3 weeks later, you know.
Yeah. Sitting on a train for 3 weeks. Yeah, we can cut that out.
Yeah, exactly. So in the first 2 books, there's Fort is on a timeline. There's a man that he has heard of that has ancient esoteric knowledge, that this man is only a rumor at this point. But part of that rumor is every 3 years he shows up in Cairo during Ramadan, and he's going to be there. And so Fort has had this timeline right from the very first book to get to Cairo by a certain date, find this man, and probe him for some secrets that he believes this character can answer. And so the first 2 books really are all of a setup for the third book. Is Fort is trying to find this man, and so at the end of the second book, they're on their way to Egypt. And so the first book picks up with them arriving in Egypt and the adventure that ensues, not just in tracking down this man, but a paranormal investigation. And I probably don't want to give away too much there, but there's a few allusions to what may be happening there in the first couple of books. And so, because I like to have more than one story going on, there's a few layers of stories going on in the third book, where Fort, one, is finding this mysterious character. 2, having a paranormal investigation with Ripley and his cohort, and also an introduction of some more of my villains, essentially, that I want to have unfold in this series.
How far do you have these books outlined?
Wow. Seeing as I was originally scripting this,
it definitely sounds like this is intentional. Like you said, book 1 and 2 were built up for 3, so clearly you had those 3 plotted out, right?
Really, I plotted out really loosely, but I plotted out, you know, 2 seasons of a TV show.
Okay. Oh yeah, right. Because you wrote it as a screenplay before, right?
So each book has proven to be essentially an episode. So,
Ooh.
you know, yeah,
So
I have a
15
lot of
books?
stories.
So 15, 16 books?
I would love to make this a 12 book series. Like I would absolutely love that.
Well, it sounds like you're getting great reviews. It might happen.
Well, I'm always surprised. It's really rewarding too. Like as a new writer, the fact that people are really responding to them well. Like we had good sales again this week, and some great reviews came in. And I mean, reviews. There's nothing makes you feel better than a great review for your book. That's
That's so anyone watching who loved a book, go leave a review. Like you just heard it from the author.
Yeah, it's the best thing.
Yeah.
Because not only is it rewarding and it becomes the fuel for creativity and continuing the work, it is one of the number one ways to raise a book's profile for the next reader. Like especially if you're relying on something like Amazon, which we're all hooked with now.
Yeah.
The way those algorithms work, like if there's a lull in people's interest in your book falls out of their sight.
Right.
So you need to be making regular sales, but reviews, and especially great reviews, they just keep bringing it back up in front of people.
That's exactly how it works.
Yeah, and inevitably, you got to be in front of people to sell books.
Yeah, so. And it's like you got to play the game. Like you got to sell books and get reviews to stay up there. But everyone listening, we need you to help us play the game by leaving those reviews. Like we can't do it alone.
And sometimes I feel so bad because I'll be talking to people through social media who are saying I got your book, loved the art, loved all these sorts of things, and you're like thank you, and then you're like, now can I ask you a favor?
Yeah, right, right.
Now I need something from you.
Speaking of loving it,
can you turn that into 5 minutes of going back to Amazon and leaving a review?
And it really is that quick. Like leaving a review is so fast. It's so easy.
And it's so important, and I do a lot of that. I try to connect with people who reach out and talk to them about the book. I like to ask people who read the book, what did you like? Like what did you like about the book? And is there anything that you didn't like? And I people like to give feedback. So I've been lucky that way that people reach out on social media. I think it's very easy these days to contact an artist that you like and say, oh, I loved what you did, or the thing stinks, or whatever, and I think that engaging with people, it kind of, most of the time it reaffirms what I already thought, and sometimes it surprises me. Like I was saying about these periphery characters, like there was one I wasn't even going to continue bringing along in the adventure, but now I have to because everybody's so interested. I'm like, I wasn't even thinking. Well, and the criticism is great too. Like that's the other thing. Like when somebody likes your work but still has something that they point out, that is priceless because it's heartfelt. It's a sincere criticism of your work, and you got to hear that. Yes.
And it stings every time.
It does. I try not to let it get to me because I had such low expectations of my own writing.
Okay.
It's been pretty good because as a guy who had never really written anything before this, I was not expecting big things. I realized I was doing it because I loved it. I wasn't going to do it for sales. I wasn't doing it for acknowledgement or any of that. I was doing it because there was this thing inside me and I had to get it out. And the fact that people are really enjoying it has been just such a tremendous reward that, I'm totally prepared for a few criticisms.
Yeah, sure. What was the process like of outlining it? Because obviously you had it all outlined in the screenplay, but what was it like working on outlining the screenplay?
Well, that was a steep learning curve.
Because you've never done anything like that before, right?
Yeah, nothing. I took a course. I took an online course, and it was great. Honestly, it was really great. It was through a Screencraft. Thumbs up to Screencraft. They run some great courses. And it forces it. It's good in that sense that it forces you to answer questions, and that's a great process. You may have what you think is a great idea, but it may not be fully fleshed out. Sometimes you can get a resource that makes you answer questions that you hadn't considered, and doesn't let you go until you can answer those questions. Okay. So that process helped me outline the pilot. But because I had been thinking about the whole thing for months and months before I ever started on the keyboard, I would even had this notebook that I was just writing down all these what would be great adventures, for these characters. And so I had originally kind of wandered in wanting to revisit all the Universal classics, and almost like literally the Universal classics, because I wanted to have a story. I wanted to have a story with a mummy. I wanted to have my own version of a Frankenstein.
Okay.
I wanted to have my own version of a vampire. I wanted to have my own version of
Okay.
a werewolf, and have them be completely different than anything anybody's ever seen before. Wholly unique versions of these things that again exist as tropes. And the big thing for me is I believe that you need to have a set of rules, and everything has to fit within that rules. So for me, my paranormal situations, they have to fall into one of a handful of categories that can ultimately be explained.
Okay.
There's nothing that is just sheer magic. Like I'm really trying to bring the science into it. So there is a reason why there is this werewolf. There is a bona fide reason. It's not just ancient mysticism or some old curse or something, but it's a real thing. And it's just something that people completely don't understand.
Interesting.
Because that was Fort's thing. Like Fort, the original real Fort, he believed that there was an explanation for all this stuff. He just didn't know what it was yet. And he felt like it was just, these were things that science had abandoned. And so his first book is called, what is it called? The Damned. But he referred to that stuff that science had damned. Like whatever the dominant science of the day is, we can't use this science to explain this thing. Therefore, we're not even going to talk about it. We're just going to put it on the shelf of, strange things that weird people see. But I like for everything to kind of fit into a realm of reason and that there's a reason why this is happening. So that was part of my original scripting out of these things. I knew there was all these points I wanted to hit. I wanted to hit the vampire. I wanted to hit the mummy. I wanted to hit, aliens. I wanted to hit, Martians. All these sorts of things all along the way. And so, I use those as sort of creating a map around the world where we would go. And so each book, we pick up, we head to a new place, have a new adventure. There's always some fallout from it. Sometimes we acquire a little more of the big conspiracy. And that's the other thing. They're in that sort of way, like the X-Files or something existed. You have your episode, you have your monster of the week, but in the background, there's a long simmering conspiracy going on. And, I love probing the ideas behind some of the popular conspiracies. And so I'm trying to basically weave the one great unified theory of conspiracy that's happening in the background.
Okay.
That conspiracy that explains everything.
Right. Yeah, of course. Yeah. The Illuminati.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds fantastic. We're almost at an hour. We're at 53 minutes, which is fine. We can keep going for a little bit. But I do want to segue off of books for a little bit and kind of just talk about other things you do. Before I do, everyone go check out his books. They sound incredible. If you've lasted this long through this episode, you are interested. So just go ahead, go buy it, buy the series. I know I'm going to. I'm definitely going to be checking them out. So
Cheers.
Everyone else should as well. You practice... practice archery? I don't know. An archer? I don't know what you call it.
I'm an enthusiast. Let's put it that way. I'm an enthusiast.
Do you actively shoot?
Yes. In fact, I just bought a new bow at the beginning of the pandemic. So I had a collection of bows that I lost in a fire.
No.
Yeah, my family experienced a fire a couple years ago, and I lost a lot of stuff. And so it's only recently that I'm replacing some of these things. And so I've got a new bow for myself and one for my kids, so that we have a little more stay-at-home fun, things to do.
I've never shot a bow. I'm very interested in it. It's definitely something I want to do. I've heard it's very meditative to do?
I think it is. I think it is. I don't know where my fascination with it began. I've always had bows ever since I was young. Like it was one of my first toys. And I've always lived in a rural place my whole life, and so there's been lots of opportunity. And if you have a big yard and lots of time in your hands, and you don't want to spend much money, archery is a great hobby.
You don't want to spend much money.
Yeah.
What should someone who's trying to get into it be looking for in a bow?
Well, there is a lot of different choices, and I mean, I think you start simple. It's just your plain longbow is in a lot of ways the best. I mean, you can get up into these really advanced compound bows and recurve bows, and I mean, it's really exploded in the last 10 years. The technology. But I ultimately like simple bows. I don't hunt. Like I'm not that sort of archer. Not to say I wouldn't someday, but I don't. Um, I like target practice. I don't know. I just like the peacefulness, being out in the yard. I've never done it competitively or anything like that. It's really just hobby.
Right.
I always had a fascination with the green arrow. Maybe it started there. I really don't know where it started.
Something that allures me to it is you go outside. You're not inside all day. It forces you to be outside, and it's something that you can like quantitatively see you are getting better. I think that's something that interests me.
Yeah. I mean, I'm the same. And I mean, I'm into all sorts of that sort of stuff. Any of that sort of like projectile, like honing of a skill. Like I like that sort of thing. And again, it goes back to my upbringing. I grew up in a very rural place. A lot of elder family members were hunters and these sorts of things. And so, there was always this stuff around. And, you're always fascinated by these things that the adults do, and you get your own version of it. And I don't know, there's just something cool about bows. I don't know.
I mean, I agree. So there's something cool
yeah,
about
you just
it.
Feel great with one. You feel great,
Yeah.
And you're not going to shoot yourself in the face with it.
Yeah,
That's extra nice.
No, it goes the opposite direction. Like you're definitely
going
not
the opposite way.
Yeah. So what other hobbies you have out there? What other things are you doing on your island?
Well, when I'm not working, my son and I we like to tour around back roads and back trails on dirt roads. I mean, where we live, there's lots of beaches. We're kind of spoiled for beaches here, so I like to do that. I'm a lifelong comic book reader. I've got a tremendous comic book collection. I love just playing with that. I'm always rereading old comic books, and I've kind of entered a phase in my life where I'm starting to sell off old comics, just because why not?
So if anyone's interested out there,
find me on eBay.
Yeah. You say eBay, right? Is that where you're selling them?
Yeah, well, I find eBay is the best place. It's one of the purest market forms in the world. Like, nobody pays more than what they want on eBay.
That is true. That is very true.
And for some reason, like a lot of other, like eBay's an early website, in the internet age, and they've lost their market to a lot of different things. But it's strangely enough, it's still a fantastic market for comic book buyers and sellers. For some reason they have persisted on eBay. Amazon never got into selling old comics.
Careful what you say. They might be probing this video with their technology.
One.
How often, if you have at all, do you visit America?
Oh, probably about once a year, maybe.
What are some of the major differences between Canada and America, other than Trump?
Yeah, well, and I don't know. Like, Canada's a big country, and we're not the same from one end to
Okay.
the other, like any place. I find that to be even more amplified in the U.S. Like, when you say Americans, I think of like hundreds of different types of people. Like, there's really no uniformity to that. The people who are living in Connecticut don't have a lot in common with the people in Florida, don't have a lot in common with the people in Colorado,
very different.
You really are like 50 countries. So the big differences in America, well, it's a cliche. Canadians are ridiculously polite. You know, we get down there and we seem soft because we're so manner driven and polite on for the most part. Not to say that Americans aren't, but they just aren't like Canadians are. Like we apologize for apologizing too much. It's ridiculous. And that's just how we're raised. We're just raised to let the other go first.
Okay.
Whereas I think in America, it's more common for I'll go first, thank you.
Yeah.
That's a big difference. And so we always had that little socialist thread woven through us. And you see it in our systems, our healthcare system, though not perfect, definitely it has some weaknesses. But you may not get the best Medicare in the world here, but nobody gets left behind, and that's the difference. Like rich people in Canada who want the best, they go to the U.S.
That's what I've heard.
But you don't need to have any money in your pocket to go see a doctor here. You can have nothing, and you can still see a doctor and be treated for whatever's wrong with you.
Yeah.
So that's a really good thing. But like I said, it's not. We don't have the best healthcare system in the world, but it takes care of everybody. Beyond that, there's not a lot of differences. You have your liberals, we have our liberals. You have your rednecks, we have our rednecks. Conservatives are one way there, conservatives are one way here. We have all the same sort of mixes.
What are the food differences like?
Well, there's a lot of cliches about Canadians. We don't all eat maple syrup every day for sure.
Every other day?
Not even that often. We're full of cliches, and sometimes we play to those cliches when an American is around, but it's not really the way that we live. So food, I think fast food is a bigger deal in the U.S. I think you have more of that sort of like franchised. You definitely have more franchises,
there's
and
a ton of franchises.
the availability of those franchises. We definitely have most of those things here, or our own versions of them. But I think perhaps more people like actually eat at home here, and so we do. We have kind of a melting pot of cultures here. So we North American style pizza, and we like lots of home cooked roasted dinners, and we definitely have some novelties here that I wouldn't want to trade. Poutine is a fantastic thing, but again, can't eat that every day. Yeah. We're pretty proud of our coffee up here. We definitely drink a lot of coffee.
You drink a lot of coffee?
Yeah, me personally, yes, and as a culture, lots.
How much coffee are you drinking a day?
Oh, God, I'm back up to like 4 or 5 cups a day.
You said back up to, so you were there, then you cut back.
Yeah, I'd cut back for years, but then my work changed, and I don't know, and I just entered a different period of my life and started drinking coffee again, and so I'm back up to I've already had 4 cups today, and I'm probably gonna have another one when I get off.
It's like almost 4 o'clock where you're at. It's past 4, and you're going to drink coffee.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Does it keep you up, or does it not really affect you much?
As I get older, I find it affects me more. So like, I don't drink anything. Like I don't drink coffee after say 5 or 6 p.m.
Okay.
That's sort of my break. And in any caffeine, if I'm going to drink any caffeine, like after supper, it's got to have alcohol in it. Like, or it's going to keep me up all night.
Okay. What are some things that you've learned? Because you said you're 46?
46 or 47, yeah, one or the other. 2020. I'm 47 actually.
47. What are some things that you wish you knew when you were younger? Just about anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be about food or Canada or.
It's a good question. I feel like I'm a little bit of a unique case. I have always sort of seemed maybe a little older than I really was. And I had some jobs at a very young age that put me in a position where I was surrounded by a lot more mature people. So, for example, I ran a bar from like age 18 to 25.
You were running a bar at 18. What's the drinking
Yes,
age in Canada?
19.
Okay.
So that was a bit of a scam I had going. But
Yeah, sure.
but I ran this bar, and it was like a community type bar, and there was people from every walk of life who would come in there. It was kind of a quiet place for the most part, and you would see people, from every spectrum of life, and people love to talk to a bartender. I don't know what it is. People just love to like connect with a bartender, and so I would always like probe people. I was also studying philosophy at university at the time, and so I was full of high ideas.
Sure.
And I'd always like kind of probe people, and that was the question I'd often put to them. I'd always say, if you could go back and live your life all over again, what's one thing you would change? And you know what? That question, for example, always had a universal response. Can you imagine what it is?
I wish I read more.
No, it's that I wish I had spent more time. I wish I had spent more time with my children when they were young.
Yeah, more time with family.
Universal. It doesn't matter how rich or how successful or anything like that. Every man I ever asked that question to, that was their response. And so, being what I believed at that time to be a student of the universe, I used to really make strong mental notes about these things that I'd learned from people. And so, when it became my own turn to be a father, I remembered those sorts of lessons. Be present when it's important. Your life is a long time, but your children are only young for a short period.
Yeah.
And so to answer your question, what would I change? I probably would have explored writing earlier in life.
That's what I thought you were going to say. Realistically, I was like, you said you got into it late. It's such a rewarding thing. Even if you're the only one who reads it, or your wife's the only one who reads it, there's something rewarding about writing that book.
There is, and it pains me sometimes on like social media to see all these people who are struggling with the confidence to continue writing. I think that's got to be such a terrible thing because, I always try to point out to them, like, I know most people write because they dream of success. It's the wrong reason to write. You need to write because you love writing.
Yeah.
You need to love creating what you're creating. Otherwise, it's a crazy amount of work for no good reason.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, like, if you don't self-publish and you want to go traditional, you're going to get 100 rejections.
Yeah.
For something that you don't like.
Yeah.
That's like me going to trial for the MBA. I'm only going to get rejected.
Yeah. And I'm going to do it 100 times.
Yeah. No.
Yeah. So I think that stuff is important. Like, do what you love. I mean, we always hear that cliche our whole lives. Do what you love. You'll never work a day in your life. Well, most of us don't have that real option.
Right.
I always cringe when I hear people say that because it's like, maybe I'm not going to get to be an astronaut. So
maybe not, but you might.
I'm guessing. I'm just guessing. I don't have what it takes anymore. Not the right stuff. So sometimes you just have to. Find that thing in your life that you do love doing and just do it because you love it. Don't do it because you want someone else to love it, or you need some sort of affirmation, or you're trying to prove something. Like my wife, she worries a little more about book sales and these sorts of things and timelines and all this sort of stuff. And I'm a little more like, hey, we create our own timelines. We're not working for anybody else.
Hey, you self-published it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I understand you're like, I'd like to have it done by now, but if it goes a little long, you have a job, so it's
and that's the thing. We both work full time and all that sort of stuff. So I don't need the extra pressure of having like hard, fast, firm deadlines on when books need to be ready by, because life is already complicated enough. And as much as I got a little derailed with the current book because of the pandemic, and I'm noticing a lot of people had a very similar experience. You would think that this time of people being kind of shut in would be incredibly productive time. But the reality of it is, I usually work in a quiet environment where I can really do deep dive into writing and research. Well, when you have two teenagers who don't go to school anymore, and a wife who works from home, and pets and whatnot, there's no more quiet place to work. So I sort of realized that I couldn't fight it. I needed to sort of shelve writing for a little bit and worry about the issues at hand, which was, the pandemic and people's overall mental health and, everything that was going on around that. So we are a little behind on our third book. We had kind of hoped to be publishing it earlier this year. We may get it out before the end of the year. I don't know. I'm not sure. It's hard to say exactly because I refuse to rush it. I refuse to let it get out the door before it's ready.
Yeah, you want to be ready. How many?
Yeah, and for me, that's most important. It's gotta pass all the smell tests before I'm going to let anybody at it.
I was going to ask you, how many drafts do you normally do? Like 100?
A lot.
Yeah. Well, because it has to pass your test and the wife, right?
Yeah. So because it goes through that process, like I was saying, how I go over from beginning to end, she goes over beginning to end, and I go over to beginning to end. We end up with, we could get well into 10 drafts. Yeah. Ooh. But, a lot of those drafts, there may not be big changes happening. Right. But that process of going back and forth, I always refer to it as like a distillation. Like it really distills it down to like something really polished. And then we're lucky. I have a remarkable group of highly critical friends. And so once we have our final our near final draft, I give it to these people who have absolutely no qualms about tearing my ego apart.
How nice of them.
Yeah, and they love the opportunity. So then they get into the book, and fortunately, most of them really enjoy the story, but have absolutely no problem telling me, don't you really know what this word means, or whatever, like that makes no sense, or you need to explain this further, or are you serious, So. Then after it goes through that battery of tests, then we take it back and we give it the final polish.
Sure.
And then we actually send it to a final editor.
Wow. So
but my wife is quite a natural editor herself. So really, these books are pretty highly edited, which is great.
It's so funny. So there's some people out there who don't edit their work, and they're not published. You're doing 10 drafts. Like, you got to edit your stuff.
You do. And you need someone else to edit your stuff. Like, that's the really important, because no, I shouldn't say that. I've learned otherwise. I used to think everybody loves their own work. Like everybody totally loves what they did. But you need someone who doesn't love everything you did. You can't let your mom edit this, like you need someone who's like totally willing to like let you know what they really think. And you got to handle it. You just got to take it,
One of my friends is like that. He'll highlight stuff and be like, "What the frick were you doing?" But we have such a good relationship because he's so honest with me about like something that I put time and effort into, and I'm like, "What do you think?" Because I honestly don't know. Because it's good to me, but what do you think? And he'll point stuff out, or he'll say he likes it. But it's created such a good friendship because he's just the honesty between it.
Yeah, and that's you're really lucky when you have someone like that in your life. Someone who can be honest with you, and it doesn't hurt, and that you hopefully can be likewise just as honest with, and you're not like hurting them. Yeah. I generally welcome criticism. I come from I don't know. I just have always been surrounded by highly critical people, and I probably am one myself. And I just don't. I really try never take it personally. You got to have a certain amount of confidence in who you are and what you're doing, and just accept that criticism is criticism.
Yeah. That's good. Good advice. Good advice.
Yeah, and
it's true.
I think everybody wants to see the best thing, and so when somebody's telling you that this thing betrays this character, everything else about this character makes sense, but this thing betrays their ultimate core, you have to really take a hard, long look at that. Is the person who's telling you that right? Maybe they are.
Yeah. I think that's the good question. Is you have to look at it and say like, is the critique accurate?
Yeah. And I've definitely created a bit of a farm of the critics I want. Like
Mm-hmm.
I have about 5 or 6 people now that I love to put my nearing final draft in their hands because I can't get over the things that they find. I'm
Yeah.
amazed. I'm like, and they don't even find the same things. And I love getting it back and going through their notes. Like I find that
Sure.
actually really
Yeah.
a richly challenging experience.
Yeah.
Again, usually requires a bottle of wine.
It's one of those. All right, honey, we need to have a nice dinner. It's
Yeah,
time to read this.
yeah.
Well,
This is gonna hurt a little bit.
well, I do want to go ahead and wrap it up. We've been hanging out for a while.
Yeah, and
I've had a
this
great
by
time.
the way, I really appreciate your time, Eric.
Yeah,
This has been a lot of fun.
it's been great. This is almost every conversation I've had has been like this, and just doing this with people is just so rewarding. I learned so much. Like I know
Cool.
I'm helping you guys out, and I love doing that. But I've been just so blessed to learn from people like you. You just know stuff that I
If
don't know.
honestly, you got a great thing going on here. I think it's a really interesting
Yeah.
project.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much. What advice can you give to people before we go out? Just anything, whatever you want to. Any advice?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to try something, you should try it. Like, don't talk yourself out of things. Like really, um, I struggled with the idea of, am I could I ever be good enough to write a book?
Mm.
And that was such a waste of energy. That was such a waste of energy because you don't have to know everything as long as you have people in your life who are going to give you a hand with it.
Yeah.
Like I am. My projects are a collection of other people's energies, and it was wrong for me to spend so much time debating whether or not I should do this. Like, if there's something that you feel strongly about, do it.
Man, that is fantastic advice. That is such good advice. I I hope everyone listens to it and goes out there and tries something that they've wanted to try for a long time and they just haven't done it, or something that just pops in their head. Like try it. You never know if you're gonna like it or not. Just try it.
And things seem very daunting, like, and they are, but everybody should remember that every big project is really just a collection of small jobs.
Yeah.
And it's best not to look at like the big job too hard. Look at each small job.
Yeah. Yeah. Writing a book, you still write it chapter by chapter.
Yeah, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph. And that's how you keep moving a project forward, not by like getting freaked out and intimidated by the fact that you need to come up with 20,000 more words.
Yeah. Yeah. You worry about that in draft too.
Exactly. That's all down the road.
All right, Jeff. Well, thanks so much for being here. Thanks for watching, everyone. I appreciate your time and for sticking around this long through the video. Please hit the subscribe button. Check Jeff out on Twitter and other maybe social medias. I'll have them in the description below. Whatever, you'll see them down there. All right, Jeff. Thanks again for being here. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time.
Thanks a lot.